Jessica because her star began to rise after the royal wedding, despite Jessica already being so well connected thanks to her husband and his family that had previously opened multiple doors.
For years, she said nothing. No interviews, no clarifications, no rebuttals. Then, quietly at first, remarks attributed to Jessica Mulroney began circulating, suggesting the silence had not been loyalty, but restraint. The words that followed were careful, emotional, and loaded with implication. I kept quiet too long. No direct accusation, no detailed timeline. Yet the moment her name re-entered the conversation, attention snapped back to Meghan Markle, and a friendship once described as unbreakable was suddenly recast as unresolved. We examine how Mulroney's apparent break from silence reframed the past, why the palace watched closely, and how implication reshaped a story that had never been formally told. For nearly half a decade, Jessica Mulroney stayed off the record. No interviews, revisiting the past, no memoir teasers, no social media clarifications. In celebrity culture, that kind of quiet is rarely accidental. It is usually read as loyalty, sometimes as fear, and occasionally as strategy. In this case, it was interpreted as a form of protection.
I'm here to discuss Jessica Mulroney, Meghan's former BFF, 100% Markle.
That interpretation hardened during the years when Mulroney's name faded from royal coverage, even as questions about pre-royal relationships intensified around Meghan Markle. Fashion editors remembered Mulroney as more than a friend. She had been a stylist, a confidant, a gatekeeper in Toronto during Meghan's ascent. When the royal chapter began, Mulroney disappeared from the narrative almost overnight. Then came the words that reopened it. I kept quiet too long. The phrase first appeared as a quotation attributed to Mulroney, relayed by media insiders. There was no formal sit-down interview, no exclusive, just a line that suggested regret and restraint, delivered with enough ambiguity to ignite interest without stating a charge. Editors recognized the danger immediately. When someone known for silence signals that silence was a mistake, audiences assume there is something worth hearing. Newsrooms moved carefully. Attribution was scrutinized. Context demanded. Was this a confession, a reframing, a personal reckoning? The answers were unclear, but the effect was immediate. Mulroney's name re-entered the bloodstream of royal commentary, and with it, the unresolved history of a friendship that had once been portrayed as unbreakable. The background mattered. In Toronto, before palace protocol and press gates, Mulroney had been a constant presence. She arranged looks, managed introductions, and navigated a social scene where proximity translated into opportunity. Those who worked in that circle described a relationship built on access and trust. When Meghan's life changed, the power dynamics changed with it. That shift became the unspoken antagonist. Editors replayed archival footage from charity galas and fashion events in Toronto. Mulroney appeared beside Meghan, relaxed and directive, a professional guiding a rising star. Analysts noted how abruptly that visual disappeared once royal engagement plans moved forward. No public falling out. No explanation, just absence. Inside Buckingham Palace, the re-emergence of Mulroney's voice was noted, not welcomed. Palace advisors, according to correspondents with long access, viewed this as a private relationship dispute with no institutional role. The guidance was distant. Do not engage. Do not contextualize. Do not invite escalation. That decision immediately split opinion. One camp argued the palace was right. Personal friendships are not constitutional matters. Engaging would only legitimize rumor. The opposing camp worried that silence would allow implication to harden, especially when the implication came from someone positioned as an insider witness rather than a critic. The human drama sharpened as commentators parsed Mulroney's phrasing. Kept quiet implies knowledge. Too long implies cost. Together, they suggested a moral reckoning rather than a publicity grab. Supporters of Meghan argued the line was vague by design, inviting interpretation without responsibility. Critics argued that delayed speech often carries weight precisely because it suggests restraint. Dates began circulating in coverage, cautiously framed. Analysts referenced the period around the royal wedding preparations, the relocation to the United Kingdom, and the sudden cooling of Toronto-based friendships. No one alleged misconduct. The discussion centered on behavior, expectation, and imbalance.
The entire Mulroney family, or all three children, Ivy and Brian and John,
yes.
going to be, these are the children of Jessica and Ben Mulroney.
The antagonist structure took shape. On one side stood a former confidant signaling regret for silence. On the other stood a public figure whose narrative had been carefully managed through selective disclosure. Between them stood institutions committed to saying nothing. television panels filled the gap. Some framed Mulroney as a witness to transformation, someone who saw a shift in priorities and felt discarded. Others framed her as revising history, seeking relevance after years out of the spotlight. The lack of specifics allowed both readings to coexist. Meghan's absence from the conversation became its own signal. There were no attributed responses, no background briefings. Supporters described this as discipline, a refusal to dignify insinuation. Critics described it as avoidance. In a media environment driven by reaction, silence rarely remains neutral. Behind the scenes, fashion insiders added texture without clarity. They described how stylists often occupy ambiguous roles, both professional and personal, and how those roles can fracture under pressure. They cautioned against assuming betrayal where evolution might explain distance. Their caveats struggled to compete with the emotional pull of a narrative about a broken friendship. Online, the story accelerated beyond editorial restraint. Old photos were reposted with new captions. Moments once described as supportive were reinterpreted as transactional. None of this was verified. Much of it contradicted itself. Yet repetition created familiarity, and familiarity bred belief. Palace advisors monitored the escalation with concern. They understood how reputational bleed works. Even without allegations, an implication from a former insider can linger. Future coverage would reference this moment as context, regardless of what followed. That lingering effect was the risk of engagement and the cost of silence. By evening, the language of coverage shifted subtly. Quote, became confession. Silence became restraint. Each shift escalated the stakes without adding facts. Editors admitted privately that the story's power lay not in what Mulroney had said, but in what she had suggested she had not said before. The temperature had changed. What began as a personal reflection had become a reframing of history. No names were accused, no actions specified. Yet the narrative had acquired momentum because it aligned three forces that rarely coexist quietly: a former insider, a powerful silence, and an audience primed to believe there was more. In royal storytelling, that alignment is often enough to keep a story alive long after the words that sparked it have faded.
Harry jumped on a private jet to Vegas to watch astronaut Katie sing to a giant turd in a toilet bowl. I'm not kidding. Google the pictures. Katie and Orlando were spotted at Ellen's house, along with Harry and Meghan.
As the line attributed to Jessica Mulroney continued to circulate, the focus shifted from what she said to what she might have seen. Commentators stopped asking whether her silence had been intentional and started asking why it had lasted so long. In royal-adjacent stories, duration confers authority. The longer someone stays quiet, the more their eventual words are treated as evidence of restraint rather than impulse. Coverage rewound the tape to Toronto. Before palace schedules and press corridors, Mulroney's role had been visible and functional. She managed fittings, negotiated access, and smoothed introductions at charity galas and industry events. This was not a casual friendship, analysts argued. It was proximity with purpose. When that proximity ended abruptly, the absence itself became a clue. The timeline mattered. Commentators mapped the months leading up to the engagement announcement and the move to the United Kingdom. They noted the sudden disappearance of Mulroney from public appearances, the lack of farewell messaging, and the absence of explanation. No accusation followed. No reconciliation was documented. The break was clean, and that cleanliness fueled speculation. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors watched the coverage harden. According to correspondents with long access, the palace viewed this as a private dispute with no institutional relevance. The guidance was unchanged. Do not engage. Do not contextualize. Do not invite further inquiry. Yet even within that restraint, a quiet division emerged. One faction argued that allowing a former insider to frame history without response was risky. They worried that the implication, once attached, would linger regardless of accuracy. The opposing faction countered that responding to personal grievances would set a precedent the institution could not control. The monarchy, they argued, cannot arbitrate friendships. That split left the field to commentators. Television panels dissected Mulroney's phrasing. Kept quiet was read as a sign of witnessing something uncomfortable. Too long was read as self-reproach. Legal analysts cautioned that neither phrase alleges misconduct. Cultural commentators countered that audiences do not parse language the way lawyers do. They respond to tone, timing, and perceived courage. The human drama intensified as Meghan's earlier interviews were replayed. Analysts juxtaposed statements about loyalty and trust with the abrupt cooling of a relationship that had once been central to her public life. The framing was careful. No one claimed betrayal. The suggestion was transformation, power, proximity, and the cost of elevation. Supporters of Meghan Markle argued that friendships often change under pressure and that expecting continuity amid royal transition is unrealistic. Critics argued that silence toward a former confidant who feels discarded reflects something deeper. Both interpretations circulated because neither could be conclusively disproven. Fashion insiders added context, complicating the narrative. They described how stylists often operate in liminal space, part professional, part personal, and how those relationships can fracture when the stakes rise. They cautioned against reading moral failure into professional separation. Their nuance struggled to compete with the emotional pull of a confidant stepping forward. Online, the story accelerated. Old photographs were recaptioned. Moments of closeness were reframed as transactional. None of this was verified. Much of it contradicted itself. Yet repetition created familiarity, and familiarity bred belief. The algorithm rewarded certainty over caution. Attention briefly turned to Prince Harry, though his role remained peripheral. Analysts noted that palace systems appeared to treat this as outside his remit. There were no attributed briefings, no effort to contextualize Mulroney's remarks as a misunderstanding. The absence reinforced the sense that institutions were closing ranks rather than clarifying history. Editors faced a dilemma. Publishing specifics would require corroboration that did not exist. Ignoring the story risked ceding narrative ground to speculation. Many chose a middle path, reporting on reaction rather than substance. That approach extended the story without adjudicating it. Behind the scenes, advisors familiar with crisis management acknowledged the bind. Denial amplifies. Explanation invites follow-up. Silence preserves boundaries but concedes interpretation. There is no clean exit when implication is framed as testimony. By evening, the language of coverage shifted again. Friendship fallout became power imbalance. Power imbalance became pattern. Each shift escalated the stakes without adding facts. Editors privately admitted that the story's endurance stemmed from Mulroney's positioning as a witness rather than an accuser. The antagonist structure was now clear. On one side stood a former confidant, signaling regret for restraint. On the other stood a public narrative carefully curated through selective disclosure. Between them stood institutions choosing distance over engagement. As the second day closed, the question had changed. It was no longer what Mulroney meant. It was whether anyone would challenge the implication she allowed to stand. In a media environment that rewards suggestion, unanswered implication rarely fades. It waits. By the third day, the story had slipped into its most enduring phase. It was no longer anchored to the words attributed to Jessica Mulroney. It was anchored to what her words suggested had been withheld. In royal-adjacent narratives, delayed speech carries a particular authority. Audiences assume that if someone stayed quiet through storms, their eventual hint of regret must be grounded in experience rather than impulse. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer a friendship story. It had become a memory story. The institution's posture remained unchanged. Personal relationships fall outside constitutional concern. Engagement would only elevate rumors. Distance, however, does not neutralize implication. It transfers interpretation outward. That reality sharpened the human drama around Meghan Markle. Coverage grew cooler and more analytical. Commentators repeated that Mulroney had not made a specific allegation. They also acknowledged that specificity was not required for reputational effect. The phrasing, "kept quiet too long," invited audiences to fill in gaps with their own assumptions. Supporters argued that this was an unfair reframing of a private separation. Friendships end, careers diverge. Silence can be dignity rather than complicity. Critics countered that Mulroney's positioning as a former insider transformed ordinary distance into something more charged. When a confidant signals regret for restraint, the public hears testimony even where none is offered. The distinction mattered less with each passing hour. Visual language did the rest. Broadcasts replayed archival footage from Toronto charity galas, backstage moments at fashion events, and early public appearances where Mulroney and Meghan stood shoulder to shoulder. Anchors cautioned viewers against inference, even as the montage implied closeness, access, and eventual erasure. In television storytelling, juxtaposition creates meaning without words. The role of Prince Harry remained marginal, and that marginality became part of the narrative. Analysts noted that palace systems appeared to bypass him entirely. This was treated as a private dispute adjacent to public life, not a family issue requiring reassurance. Harry's silence was interpreted variously as restraint, exhaustion, or lack of leverage in a story governed by implication rather than fact. Online discourse accelerated beyond editorial caution. Old posts were resurfaced, timelines were redrawn, moments of warmth were reinterpreted as transactional. None of this was verified. Much of it contradicted itself, yet repetition created familiarity, and familiarity bred belief. Royal advisors monitoring the space acknowledged the pattern. Once a former insider's silence is reframed as withheld truth, correcting the record becomes nearly impossible without details that no one is offering. Editors faced an ethical impasse. Publishing specifics would require corroboration that did not exist. Ignoring the story would cede narrative ground to speculation. Many chose to report on the reaction to the reaction, a recursive loop that sustained attention without advancing facts. Each segment that asked why Mulroney waited so long extended the story's half-life. Behind the scenes, fashion insiders attempted to restore context. They explained that stylists often occupy ambiguous roles, part professional, part personal, and that those roles fracture under pressure. They cautioned against reading moral failure into professional separation. Their nuance struggled to compete with the emotional appeal of a confidant stepping forward, however obliquely. The antagonist structure was now fixed. On one side stood implication, powered by delayed speech and proximity to insiders. On the other stood narrative control, maintained through selective silence. Between them stood institutions committed to distance and audiences committed to interpretation. As the week progressed, the language of coverage shifted again. Quote, became reckoning. Reckoning became recontextualization. Each shift moved the story further from verification and closer to memory. Editors admitted privately that even if no further comments emerged, this moment would be referenced in future coverage as background rather than headline. That long arc concerned palace advisors. They understood reputational bleed. Stories that are never resolved do not disappear. They linger as context, resurfacing whenever trust, loyalty, or power dynamics are discussed. The cost is cumulative, not immediate. Mulroney did not elaborate. She did not name names. She did not provide dates or documents. Her restraint complicated the interpretation. To some, it suggested credibility. To others, calculation. Again, the absence of detail sustained debate rather than closing it. Meghan's silence remained absolute. Supporters framed it as discipline and self-protection. Critics framed it as avoidance. In a media environment driven by reaction, silence becomes a canvas. Audiences project motive onto it, and projection hardens into belief through repetition. By the end of the cycle, nothing definitive had been established. No allegation was made, no wrongdoing alleged. Yet the impact was real because the story had evolved beyond claims. It had become a reframing of the past, a suggestion that earlier narratives of loyalty and continuity required reconsideration. Royal correspondence reflected on the lesson. In modern royal storytelling, the most enduring controversies are not the loudest. They are the unresolved ones. The moments when someone who once said nothing hints that nothing was the whole story. This episode followed that pattern precisely, not because it revealed facts, but because it altered perception. When silence breaks, even gently, memory reforms around it. What was once an absence becomes evidence in the public imagination. The palace held its line: no statement, no clarification, no attempt to arbitrate a friendship that predated royal life. That choice preserved boundaries but ceded narrative ground. In the end, the story did not end with a confession or a denial. It ended with expectation. Expectation that more might be said. Expectation that old relationships would be reread through this lens. Expectation that silence, once broken, could not be fully repaired. In royal history, expectation is often enough to keep a story alive, because when implication replaces proof, time does the rest. Some stories change not when facts emerge, but when silence ends. Subscribe, like, and share for deeper investigations into royal relationships, broken alliances, and how implication reshapes history long after words were withheld.